Welcome to Revenue Rehab, your one-stop destination for collective solutions to the biggest challenges faced by marketing leaders today. Now head on over to the couch, make yourself comfortable, and get ready to change the way you approach revenue. Leading your recovery is modern marketer, author, speaker, and chief operating officer at Tegrita, Brandi Starr.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Revenue Rehab. I am your host, Brandi Starr, and we have another amazing episode for you today. In traditional therapy, we learn just as much from others' breakthrough as we do from our own. And so today, we will explore how Mehak Chowdhary turned a major marketing breakdown into a breakthrough. When they took over, the lead flow was a total mess, and things were being manually copied into Excel. No CRM, no real qualifications, just chaos. Instead of patching things up, she built something even better. A high converting automated pipeline powered by their route to qualified lead framework. And so if you are tired of chasing junk leads and want a pipeline that actually delivers revenue, don't miss this case study. So with 15 years experience in marketing growth and brand strategy, Mehak has built and scaled businesses across sports, climate tech, SaaS, and e-commerce in Europe, the US, and Asia. Growing up with an Army officer father meant constant travel, learning how people and culture shape behaviors. An early masterclass in audience psychology that set the foundation for her career. Mehak was in broadcast journalism and later moved into global marketing. And so from scaling a multi-million-dollar climate tech pipeline to launching motorsports' most ambitious talent program, her work sits at the intersection of audience insight, strategic growth, and market-making narratives. Welcome to Revenue Rehab. Your session begins now.
Hi there, and thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to quite an enlightening discussion going ahead.
Yes, your background is really impressive, and what you've been able to accomplish in your career is equally as impressive. But before we jump into that, our industry loves its fancy jargon, but let's be real. Some of these buzzwords are just fluff, and they can hold us back more than they can help. So what's one overused buzzword that you'd love to see erased from existence?
So I know that you asked this to all your guests, and I was actually thinking of a few that are constantly repeated in my industry: low-hanging fruit, growth hacking, ecosystem, things that your guests have brought up. And then last week, I was in a conversation with a company for a short-term project, and they asked me a question that's put up the new buzzword that I dislike. When they asked me, "What is my secret sauce?" So. To me, secret sauce is almost like there's some sort of proprietary magic formula behind success, that I'm going to come in and implement and do a bit of voodoo and hocus pocus and things will work out. And I think in some ways it really undermines the fact that a marketer gets in, learns a lot about the industry and about the marketing funnel that a company is using, and then really works hard to optimize.
I was going to say, yes, I am one of those people who is definitely guilty of overusing the phrase secret sauce. And honestly, I never thought about it that way, but you do have a good point in that that does sort of frame it as if we've got a recipe for success, and it truly is never that easy. So I'm definitely going to have to work to not use that one, but I can at least promise for this discussion not to say secret sauce. How about that?
That works. In fact, on that, my approach is slightly different. So I work with Formula One licensed products, and they're one of the team principals working with Mercedes during the period that Lewis Hamilton was winning a lot of seasons, told me that across the various seasons, they didn't focus on building a new car. They actually focused on a 1% improvement around or along multiple aspects of the car, and that's what gave them the winning formula. So in a 6-season championship, the winning driver was not driving 6 cars; he was driving a 102 car evolution. And I think these micro optimizations that they were talking about, that's just so relevant to the way we work as well. That when it comes to sales and marketing, it's really about success being the result of well-planned systems, continuous optimization, and no mysterious trick.
I love that. And that is such a great analogy. I definitely might have to steal that one in the future. So now that we've cleared out the fluffy stuff, let's get into the real stuff, which is your big win. So let's start at the beginning. I know that you saw the challenge when you took over the role, but how did you recognize, like, what challenges were you facing and how did you know that you had that problem?
So we had a problem of visibility of who's where in an actual funnel. We had a problem around traceability. So who came from where, how did they progress, what's the time frame? And we had a complete lack of data. And I think the point that you brought up at the beginning, that when I asked for all of this, I received an Excel sheet. Now, I have nothing against the right formula and CRM tool, but this was a copy paste monster, as I've started to call it, where every update was manual, fields were not cleanly set out, so you really couldn't run reports, and so it was just inefficient. To me, this was not just preventing the team from seeing data, but it was preventing the team from seeing patterns and blockages. So really, it was a question of, we need to build this out, and then when we build it out, we need to understand where the problems lie and how can this process get improved.
Okay. And so thinking about, so you said visibility into the funnel, traceability of, what was actually happening, where people were coming from, and lack of data. And so was that your initial understanding of the problem? I know quite often, like, we think we have one problem, and then as we get into it, we realize that it's something altogether. So did you have a clear understanding of what the challenge was from the beginning, or did that evolve over time?
I think it evolved over time. I think you start by having a certain degree of frustration at not being able to see the origins of leads or the context, and not being able to then understand how to make them progress, and also not having access to data. So the frustration starts there, but then as you begin to work along, naturally you end up finding different issues that arise. Or again, the whole idea is you're looking at, how can I improve conversion, or how can I minimize effort within the same conversion? So where can automations take over? How can we make this whole system more efficient? So as you start going along, you once you have a CRM in place and not an Excel, then you begin to ask all the right questions. And fortunately, you have data and segmentation to be able to pull that information out for you.
Okay. And so once you identified the issue, like, what was your process? Walk me through how you started to fix this, because you completely transform things, but obviously that didn't happen all at once.
Yeah, that's true. And I won't go through the build process, but I'll tell you, I started with what I call the route to qualified lead. And first up was the question of what I call the compass, that have we set clear coordinates, especially keeping in mind the ideal customer profile. So we end up doing a lot of work as an organization around building the ICP. And especially when you're talking about scale ups, sometimes the ICPs can be large. So the ICP can end up spreading across multiple industries, several job titles, until you find who the right fit is. So first up was that, is there a way to take this ICP and put it into the CRM system in a way that you're able to understand who they are, how are they behaving, you're able to understand which ICPs are working for you and which ones are not. So it's really about transforming the concept of an ICP into something actionable inside the CRM.
Okay. And that, I think that is a really great point. And I want to dig into that a little bit, because this is something that I see so many companies not doing well. Like, I have talked to organizations, and most have some clear documented, this is our ICP. But when I ask, how does that show up in your data? Like, how can I really identify in your CRM system which of your contacts actually align to the ICP, whether it's at the contact level or the account level, depending on the business. They don't necessarily have the clear data points to be able to show that, or even to understand how much of their database is actually aligned to their ICP. And if that number is small, what do about it? And so was there data that you had to start capturing that you weren't, or start using differently? Like, talk to me a bit more about how you more tactically understood who the ICP was in the CRM.
So purely from a CRM perspective, I think you've got to ask yourself some questions, some very initial questions around what are the industries that they're sitting in. And with a couple of businesses that I've worked with, but the one we're specifically talking about, the industries were spread. At that point, we didn't know what the company size could be. So the customer profile was really across small, medium, and large. Again, we were slightly region agnostic. Of course, we couldn't cater to the whole wide world, but there was still a large amount of region that we could reach out to. And then there were things like age group, because we were looking at tech adoption, especially new tech adoption. So there was a hypothesis that potentially a younger audience would be faster at adopting new technology. So it started by just getting these basics in order, building a filter and ensuring, the moment somebody ticked multiple boxes as yes, they were now fitting into an ICP. But of course, as we went along, 6 months in, 8 months in, there were more questions. But if you start somewhere, you have room to ask more questions. So the team wanted to understand, okay, what's the revenue that they have, or how much of what percentage of revenue is invested towards something, or what's the kind of electricity being used, because this was around clean tech. So what's the electricity mix in the region that's being used, and what are the prices that they're investing in for certain products? So all of that started to go in, and the ICP really started to get narrower and more evolved. But to evolve, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's also a good lesson to take away in, using another buzz phrase. We don't want to try to boil the ocean. And so often there are like so many questions that we want to have answers to. And it's important to just start with the basics, be able to answer those basic questions, and they naturally lead into more detailed questions and getting more specific. And so, we always talk about like that audience of one for your ICP, and you really don't get there overnight. And I really like the approach that you took of like, okay, here's what we know. And then once we can look at that, we can over time start to, almost tick away at that a little bit to now, okay, we've got a crystal clear idea of who our ICP is and how they show up in the data so that we can better identify them. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got that spot on. And I think an evolution is really the core there. So if you're going to try and answer 15 things at the outset, you probably need to ask yourself, why do I need all that information? And maybe some companies are further along and are clearly aware of why these 15 pieces need to come together perfectly to then form an ICP. But by and large, the process of evolution just allows you to have a little more room. Sometimes I notice with B2B SaaS companies that they tend to have a very specific target list, which may or may not be ICP based. And they say, okay, these are the 60 enterprise clients that we need no matter what. And I think you end up getting tunnel vision there as well. So there has to be a balance in how you approach, and probably this way of ensuring that your ICP reflects in one way, then a little more, and then a little more. It just allows you to learn as you go along.
Okay. So you started talking about your route to qualified lead framework. I want to get back to that so that we can get deeper into what that entails.
So next step, I think, and this is where marketing gets involved, is that not everything is a qualified lead. So I'm extremely particular on what gets the beautiful Q next to it. And not everything that comes in is qualified. I know in a lot of organizations, and while this is very basic, but a white paper download gets into a qualified lead, and they're not qualified. That you've got a fantastic piece of content that somebody wants to engage with, but they're not a lead. They're just a contact who you can probably nurture and engage and discuss with, or you have an influence circle. But that's not the same as let's say somebody downloading a product specification sheet. Now, in the company, when I was looking at it, all downloads were given the same intent score. But a white paper download and a product spec sheet download are two very different levels of intent and qualification. So it's also about cleaning up how you look at qualified leads.
Yeah, and that is something that, if I think back to when lead scoring first became a thing, it started with some capabilities in the marketing automation platform and, with predictive analytics and intent and all those things, it has evolved a lot. But at the core of it, it really is identifying what are these actions that makes someone ready or likely to be ready to engage with sales. And I, saw so many people and still today see so many organizations go with those more generic terms of like they had a download and it's like, okay, but or they had a webinar view or a video view. It's like, okay, well, a demo video and a thought leadership video, like very, very different. And so to your point, getting to that level of granularity is really key. And so I'm curious, when you were identifying what those actions were, did you make some safe assumptions around what leads more to qualification? Or did you have data that you saw from past opportunities that were indicators for you?
So we didn't have past data. It's a new organization building out almost a new category of product. So there isn't even benchmark data out there. But we started with a few assumptions. So again, we put a ton of downloads. We put them gated. We put them ungated, so we could measure intent. You look at a white paper download, like you said, a thought leadership download versus a product spec sheet. Even with something as simple as a contact form, we built out 2 contact forms. So one was basic, it just took your details, a little bit of context of where you found us or where you work or what's the industry that you're from. And then we built a slightly more complex form, the kind that I'm very impressed by how solar companies do this, where they actually ask for your address, the size, the location of where your place is, etc. So you get into complexity that needs you to pause a moment, research what you are, and then come back. And again, because we're in hardware tech, you need to build a site, which means you've got to calculate how much area is available, how close are you to a certain energy source, etc. And while both are called contact forms, they're 2 extremely different intents in both the forms. So someone who spent 2 minutes filling in his or her details versus someone who spent almost 15-20 minutes getting some of those facts in there. And then they would go separately. We didn't do a lead score because personally, I've stopped becoming a fan of it. But what we did is, because again, the touch points can vary, the context can vary, there's just so much variable there. So instead, we just ensured that every lead that came in through, let's say, a certain form or a download was just assigned differently. So even within qualified leads, you had buckets of qualification.
I like that. And yeah, I would say, lead scoring has its value in context because there are always challenges with every form of scoring model. And I like that you are just looking at the levels of qualification and identifying what that follow-up is. And I know that, there are different, like if I look at some companies, they've got marketing development reps and those MDRs focus on things that are a bit less qualified versus your AEs that you want, they would be the ones you want calling on those people who filled out all of those details to give them specs. And so talk to me a bit more around how that showed up, because I know you said it was a smaller company. So were there different people to follow up? Were there just different plays that they ran based on the qualifications? Like how did you actually, operationalize that on the back end?
So that brings me to really the third aspect that I was working on. I call it the litmus test, but it's basically engagement that then validates intent. And you're right to say that one size doesn't fit all, and a lot of organizations tend to have different people pick up from different intent-based leads. I'll give you the specific example of an event that we carried out last year. So this was an industry, you could say an exhibition come conference that we attended. And so typically what happens at such an event is that when you're exhibiting, you have a booth and you've got your sales reps there and they're having conversations with people. Then you've got a whole bunch of people who come, look, maybe take a document, drop in a visiting card, or fill up a digital, the new scan, the QR code kind of cards. And then we had the CEO speaking at the conference as well. And so he ended up engaging with a lot of people as well. He was in a panel and then a speaking opportunity. And now all those three make it into the CRM, but there are different levels of qualification. So the networking conversations that the sales team carried out, they were then given, they weren't put into any automations within the system. Sales was allowed to handle them how they wish to. And if sales then want to put them through an automation process, they could. The business cards that we collected, they were put into a standard nurture route. So, they were informed more about product specifications, some thought leaderships in a more channeled and, and not too much of an aggressive manner. And now the CEO and the people he met, because these are not relationships that you can directly sell into. These are ones that you need to build and collaborate, and co-develop something. With these ones, we conceptualized and built some webinars and panel discussions with these guests. So we could put them and their entire followers into a different kind of flow. And from there, we built the potential to look at business opportunities. So just as an example of how a single event can produce three very different levels of leads, and then they can be dealt with in three very different ways.
Yeah, and that is such a great strategy, because so often I have seen people go to events, they're an exhibitor, they're a speaker, sometimes they'll have like private dinners or coffees or whatever, and they come back with a spreadsheet, and that whole spreadsheet gets dumped into the marketing automation, and you've got just the same level of follow-up. And the people who came by the booth because they wanted, your free tchotchkes are definitely not going to have the same response or level of urgency as those people that had a meaningful conversation with, a sales rep in a booth. And so I think that's really important for people to think about I talk a lot about orchestrating the journey. These are the levels of thoughts and decisions that I think people need to make. And so I'm sitting here just doing a dance internally, because it's no surprise that the success and the outcome came from this based on the level of thought that you put into that.
Yeah, each prospect has to be nurtured in a way that matches their level of interest and then the potential value they could bring to you. So both those aspects need to get balanced out.
Yes. And so the litmus test, is that the last step in the route to qualified lead framework?
Well, I have one more, which is what I call the bottleneck audit, and which is why really building out the CRM was so essential, because you cannot see in any form of an Excel how the data has moved along. In fact, not all CRM systems also are letting you see that. And it's extremely important to understand how did the funnel behave and what's happening with, let's say, when there is a drop in velocity, what is causing it? It's always a block at a certain stage. And to understand what's causing that delay in that stage. I noticed this, and this is with all due regards to all the salespeople out there, but sales often sees the journey as a linear series of conversations with them, while in reality, there's a lot happening between two touch points with a sales representative. And it's really important to try and understand what's happening, in which case then you need to go back and say, okay, what stage is causing the bottleneck? So is it really somewhere in the marketing nurturing? Has it been handed over? Is sales getting stuck? Let's say maybe they call a stage called contracting, or maybe they call there is a stage around sending some data. Where are they stuck? And then really trying to understand what can we do to unclog that pipe at that stage. So I think essentially what happens when a bottleneck comes is that you need to do more for the potential lead or customer to help them in their decision making. And that cannot always come through, let's say, a sales follow-up, the beautiful sales email, hi, just wondering if you had a chance to look at my proposal or the documentation. and I often tell the sales team, what do you do after a call? And you tend to go and search the company's website, you tend to go and see their LinkedIn, you tend to go and see what else is happening in the market in their space. And similarly, a customer is going to do exactly all of that. So we then try and identify first we hypothesize, then we learn. We also learn from customers what they did at a certain phase while talking to us. And then we use that really to build a nurture journey to unblock the blockage.
Yeah, and I think that that level of coordination between marketing and sales and really getting realistic about what the journey is so important because, there's all sorts of data and statistics. I think right now it's up to 80% of the journey happens without, sales being involved or before they talk to them. But then there's even sort of a part that we don't see in between interactions because in B2B, there are, the people who are engaging directly with sales. There are those people that they then take that information back to and, they're having other internal conversations. I saw recently that the buying committee is up to as large as 22 people now, which it used to be averaging at 7. So you think about all of those things that are happening. You're right in that we do have to think through what are those touch points? How do we make sure that they're getting the information they need outside of what the salesperson is actually doing? Because there's so much of that is not going to be them responding to that proposal or, they're not going to say, oh, hey, I'm talking to my colleague or, I gave your info to 8 people and now they're Googling you. Like we can just see that in the data.
Look, in economically uncertain times like we are now, especially when there's a large investment or a long-term commitment, everybody wants to de-risk the investment, right? So this can come through, the committee's gotten larger because everyone wants to be sure that they made the right decision. Everybody at various stages, including, let's say, the person who's signing the check, wants to de-risk it from their level of understanding. So that's where opinions are important. And I think that's where advocacy is playing a big role. So when we talk of things like social proof, initially when I started off almost more than 10 years back on really building out these sites and stuff, it was all about case studies and I used to find them extremely boring things to do. Today, they are so much more valid because everyone wants proof. And the moment you can build out a nice case study which talks numbers, so it's not just describing pretty things, but if you're selling products that are based on electricity, then what's the size, consumption, charge? If it's based on anything else, really, what are the main metrics? How are they working? How are they delivering? What region? Hot, cold? There's so many data points that you can talk about. And when you name a company and you put a logo, everyone knows that the company has allowed it to be placed there. I think that advocacy really, really works in today's day and age. And I think that's one of the biggest things we've done when it comes to nurture is to start putting those pieces in with a lot of authenticity.
Yes. And I do think that, especially with AI growing so much and so much being automated, that authenticity, has always been important, but it is becoming more and more important in that brand voice, brand value come across. And, people really care now, or I won't say now, care more about who they're doing business with and what they value. And so I'm really curious, as you went through this process, were there any roadblocks that you ran into in trying to move, and trying to get to your end state? And how did you navigate that?
So this time around, I was extremely fortunate to have a lot of buy-in from the sales, the biz dev team. We also had teams that were looking at proposition and strategy, and there was an immense amount of buy-in. So actually the progress that we made when it came to pulling out data or implementing techniques was almost, done in half the time that I had anticipated. And that was fantastic. A few years ago, I'd done exactly the same formula for another company, and there was absolute resistance from teams to change the way that they had been working, or to look at it, and to make that extra effort for data hygiene, especially where a ton of data sets are required. So this time around, I think the fact that the teams could align and work together, the point that you were alluding to, that sales and marketing come together, that's really a game changer for companies if done well.
Okay. Yeah. And that, it's crazy to me how much misalignment still exists between some
Yeah.
marketing and sales companies. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Um, I know going through, you talked about how initially you made some safe assumptions because you didn't have data. And then as you started getting things going, you went back and refined based on what was actually happening. I'm curious, how big was the difference between what your initial assumptions were versus what the data showed?
We weren't too far off. I think anybody who is 20-30% off, so we had that much. I think what we learned was that there were gaps in our information, which is why we went back and evolved and added more data sets. So we felt that in the conversation, if we knew some things early on, they would have informed certain decision making, or they would have led to the qualification and the process a bit different. So essentially we found gaps or shortages in what we needed as data. I think the big advantage was every lead came with insight. So there was a lot of history around their pain points, their intent signals. We built in a fixed format for notes. So it was a constant learning process really for us.
Okay. And so what was the overall outcome? What was the measurable impact of going through this exercise and really putting in place the route to qualified lead framework?
Because this was being built from scratch and we didn't have data, I think step one was there was a beautiful report that could be seen, that was discussed, that was talked about. You could talk about, let's say, why is revenue slow in this quarter versus the previous one. You could understand that, okay, June, July, August are slow months, so we are incorrectly estimating that revenue will be evenly spread out across all quarters or across months. So there were a lot of learnings there. I'm sure by the end of this year, we will have some more considerable metrics. But to be very honest, there was very visible momentum that picked up after us having all of these things implemented. And then, of course, the fact that because you have information on history, pain points, you can start putting them into buckets. You're able to put in a lot of automation that sales doesn't physically need to do. So they enjoy the fact that, oh, these things can be set as to day 5, day 7, some if then else kind of clauses put in. So for sure, there's been a massive growth in pipeline. We'll measure year on year at the end of this year, but they've clearly witnessed a large growth.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that is one of those things that, number one, I love a good, sexy report. But beyond that, I do think it's one of those things that people don't always think about, like when it comes to being able to have automations and really getting the value out of all the technologies that we pay for. There's a lot of underlying fundamentals and work that has to be done to really understand the buyer journey, what the needs are. And once you have that data and understanding, then you can safely do some automations and reduce the human effort, but you got to go through the hard work that you put in. And about how long was this process from you from when you started from that, that one messy spreadsheet to having, your great report and insights and really being able, I know it's an evolutionary thing, but that initial first phase of really getting to a solid point, how long did that take?
So I had expected it to take about 6 months to go from phase 1 to phase 2, but it took us about a little under 3. And then we went through the next evolutionary phase within the first 6 months. So I think that was much faster. And again, to the point that there was a lot of sales buy-in. And so their lessons, their inputs came in much faster. And we could really do build a well-oiled machinery in that sense.
Okay, that is awesome. It is always great when things go
Yeah.
faster than expected as opposed to slower. Um, and so, one of the best parts of learning from others is really understanding what really made the difference. And so, before we wrap up, let's make sure that our listeners walk away with insights that they can use right away. And so, if you had to do it all over again, what's one thing you'd do differently?
I would have made the CRM investment right at the start, because you already start thinking about ideal customer profiles and how it translates into your technology right at the outset. So I would not allow a a copy-paste Excel function. So I would build in as much automation as possible. It not only reduces the load, but it really allows you to think very clearly. So if you could think in terms of technology, you'll also build a lot of clarity and question yourself on how the whole process is going. And I would have had two very strong people with me who could strategically understand what's being done and operationally deploy it as well. So I think to anybody else who's out there learning or figuring what to do, please invest the time and the money in CRM and some good people.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And you are definitely preaching to the choir. That is one of the things that we do is, and it's so funny. Like it's almost sometimes I end up having conversations and I'm like, oh, this feels like a customer testimonial, even though you're not a customer. But seriously, it is one of those things that, when we've gone through similar processes with clients, it is, having brought in a lot of the expertise from having done it with other people and the gotchas and things like that. And then also being able to move faster and scale. So, for anybody who is going through this exercise, I definitely echo the need to have, really strong people who can help, guide you through this strategically and operationally. Well, this has been such a good conversation, and every good session ends with a plan for progress. And so I'd love to share, how can people connect with you if they, want to stay connected and continue to learn from you?
Yeah, so if you're a business owner with a growth or revenue challenge, or a marketer who would love to talk some more about building this out, I'm available on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect. So I'm sure you've got the LinkedIn details down there, and we can, and just reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk.
Yes. So wherever you are listening or watching this podcast, check the show notes, and we will link to Mehak's LinkedIn. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I have truly enjoyed the discussion. I'm getting tongue-tied here at the end.
Thank you so much. So you understood what's my secret sauce.
Yes, we know. And, it's funny, I wasn't going to say it, but I was like, this route to qualified lead framework does sound like the secret sauce. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed my discussion. I can't believe we're at the end. Until next time.
You've been listening to Revenue Rehab with your host, Brandi Starr. Your session is now over, but the learning has just begun. Join our mailing list and catch up on all our shows at revenuerehab.live. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at Revenue Rehab. This concludes this week's session. We'll see you next week.